Welcome everyone to the webinar, and thank you for coming. So my name is Grażyna Baranowska, and we will be hearing today from three experts on memorialization, from Silvana Mandolesi, from Ulrike Capedron, and from Kat Collins. You've seen the bios on the website. And let me start with a couple of housekeeping rules before I introduce a couple of words about this webinar. So your microphones and cameras are disabled until the Q&A, and once the Q&A will start, you will be able to turn them on as well. You can, throughout also the speaker, when the speakers talk, put questions and comments in the Q&A chat, which you all see on MS Teams. And the session will be recorded and will be possible to watch afterwards. Once we come into the Q&A, you will also be able to use the raise your hand feature in Teams. So now, with that logistics being mentioned, let me come now to the content. This initiative to propose a webinar on memorialization and enforced disappearances came from a study that we are conducting within the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances. And looking at many instances around the world where memorialization becomes a challenge and an issue also for families, we are working currently on a study on memorialization and enforced disappearances that has three main aims. So firstly, to map out the legal obligation of states in that context. Secondly, to establish good practices, to look into good practices both at state memorialization efforts and by civil society, as well as look into attacks on those who engage in commemorative efforts, and practices to protect them. And today we will speak not about the first question, the legal question, but the second two, meaning the practices and attacks on those that commemorate. And we will hear from the three speakers about different examples around the world. If you're more interested in the study that we will be conducting within the UN Working Group, then we will be issuing a call for inputs in November. So it would be wonderful to receive some inputs also from those attending today. And the study will be presented to the Human Rights Council in September next year. So we will start with 3 rounds of questions to our speakers today. And after those 3 rounds of questions, around 6 o'clock, we will open up for the Q&A. So let's now move then to the speakers to hear from them and their expertise. And I would give the first question to Silvana from Leuven, who's could you share with us some meaningful practices on memory initiatives that concern enforced disappearances, including in the digital sphere that you have also researched in your work?
Okay, hello everybody. First, and I would like to thank Grażyna for the kind invitation and the Memory Studies Association for making this event possible in the first place. So regarding the question, for me, meaningful practices of memorialization are first and foremost those that seek and succeed, or to a certain extent, in reversing the logics of disappearance. And by logics of disappearances, I refer to a set of traits or features that disappearance as a repressive strategy shares. So this applies both to enforced disappearances that occur during the dictatorships of the armed conflicts of the 70s in Latin America, where the state was the perpetrator, so classical disappearances, but also to contemporary disappearances, such as those taking place within the framework of the so-called war on drugs in Mexico, for instance, or even if we also consider as desaparecidos migrants who vanish at the Mexican border or in the Mediterranean Sea, for instance. One of these logics is the active construction of the disappeared as disposable people, people who are actively constructed not as citizens, but as individuals who can, or even should, be removed from society. So this process may take various forms depending on the historical and the social context in which disappearances occur. For instance, in the 70s in Argentina, the disappeared were labeled subversivos, as you all know, so enemies of the national values, order, security. The phrase por algo será, there must be a reason, echo this dictatorship justification of violence. So in Mexico, están metidos en algo, so means they are involved in something, carries a similar implication of complicity with criminal groups. No, but desaparecidos can also become disposable because they belong to groups that are already marginalized, poor, indigenous, women, migrants, what Butler calls ungripable lives, lives that do not matter. So memorialization practices must first and foremost seek to counter this logic, and to destigmatize or rehumanize the disappeared. And this can take, again, many different forms in different contexts. In Argentina, for instance, this resistance took shape through the construction of what has been called the figure of the innocent victim, and through a narrative paradigm shift that successfully displays the state narrative of a war against subversion with that of state terrorism responsible for human rights violations. In contemporary Mexico, memorialization efforts must counter the narrative that portray victims as supposedly involved in drug trafficking, as well as the sometimes widespread indifference towards those ungripable lives. This is not an easy task in many cases, and this also, I think, explains why certain cases gain visibility, such as the disappearances of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa, because they were young, they were students, they were close to the figure of the innocent victim, and in that case also the violence and the collusion between the state and the non-state actors were both disproportionate and visible. So this counteracts, or not would say easily, but this successfully counteracts the narrative of implicated victims and the clandestine nature of disappearances. And this is also the second, or one of the other important logics of disappearance is precisely this, the clandestine nature of disappearance. So making a person disappear, the state also makes all the information disappear. So the perpetrator, the circumstances, sometimes even the witnesses. And to counter this logic, memorial practices must confront both the state and the society with the presence of disappeared in the public sphere. So in other words, they must make this absence visible, and also they must show that this absence matters to everyone. Expressed, for instance, in slogans such as "Los desaparecidos nos faltan a todos." The disappeared are missing for all of us. There are many different strategies that I'm not mentioning, but just I wanted to focus very briefly on one that is one of the most powerful ways in which the disappeared has been represented. That has become a kind of icon or symbol, that is the use of photograph to represent the disappeared, the visual force of photography. The photograph of the disappeared evolved from this initial use that you all probably know by Mothers of Plaza de Mayo in the 70s, but also it's widely used now, Saturday Mothers in Turkey, Peruvian exhibition like Chuchapanap. So this became a powerful instrument of memorialization, not only the photograph of the disappeared itself, but also what Diana Taylor in an article called traumatic meme, that it's a conjunction of the grieving mother using or holding the photograph itself, and the chant demanding justice. Why this device is effective or can be considered effective for several reasons. First, it serves as a proof of existence of the disappeared person, what the state seeks to erase. Second, it creates a human connection, the photograph that is looking at the viewer, between the disappeared and someone who is looking into the eyes of the disappeared. This generates a kind of emotional intimacy. And of course, it makes the loss visible, the ambiguous loss. In this sense, it's not a representation of a loss, it's the photograph performs that loss. It turns mourning into a collective act of seeing. And in the sense, a photograph of the disappeared as a device of memorialization condenses different meanings around or surrounding disappearances, not only these ambiguous laws, but also the activism of at least 40 years. When we see a photograph, we also remember all of the activism since the 70s, at least until now. And to finish, regarding the digital, it's difficult to separate the digital and the non-digital. Both are intertwined today. We see is that these gestures performed in the streets now are amplified online, no, with certain logics that has to do with speed, with virality, with global circulation. But there are no new practices. I mean, in the digital sphere, they do not replace earlier practices. It reanimates them, allowing, in the best case, the disappeared to remain visible and to claim a presence across both physical and virtual spaces.
Wonderful, Silvana, and it's really good kind of to see the connection and to say, well, those traditional ways of memorialization, they're still the key ways, and here is a way also to remember. And when you talked about kind of the goal, right, to have the person, the construction of the person brought back, then it reminded me of one of the slogans, also say their names, kind of to really keep that person, the memory of that person alive, and this is really what a lot of the families indeed are asking. So thank you very much for that. I would now like to give the floor and bring a question to Kath to share with us some meaningful practices that you have come across with regard to disappeared persons, maybe some from Ireland, to also have different perspectives on that. And I hope now we will the microphone will work. Looking forward to hearing you.
Is that can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very so good. we have this peculiar thing going on where because I'm working between devices, I can speak on this one and listen on the other one. So please forgive me. You'll have to wave at me when you want me to stop because I can't hear now. I can hear the rest of the time. Sorry, just a technical issue this end. Thank you for the invitation. And just in regard to the question, it's interesting the contrast between the north of Ireland and South America, which is my other setting, around this question of memorialization and the visibility, the social visibility of the disappeared. With some differences, of course, the situation in Chile as regards the victims of enforced disappearance, the detenidas y detenidos desaparecidos of the Chilean dictatorship, and those who were subject to political execution. The situation is more similar to what Silvana has just described, and the issues tend to be around what is it that we are foregrounding and highlighting. You know, in many ways, the disappeared that have been the most visible victims of the past of the Pinochet regime. And there's almost a hierarchy of victims, which is a term that in Northern Ireland means something quite different, where the detenido desaparecido is constructed as the archetypal victim, almost. And you will hear people say, you know, that they took the best of us. These are the most important cases. You will hear judges and relatives and survivors also, I've heard, until they said, oh, of course, we understand that, you know, this is the most important question to resolve and our cases must take a back seat. Now, there's lots and lots to unpack there already. But here in the north of Ireland, which is where I am at present, in fact, the situation is the inverse. And if anything, the issue of the disappeared has been the least visible issue of the whole period of the Troubles. So this is the 30-year period in which between 1968 and 1998, during which almost 3,000 people were killed in Troubles-related violence. So the victim total, dead and disappeared people, is almost the same as in Chile, where we have 3,200 registered cases of death and disappearance. But in Northern Ireland, the proportion of those that are disappeared is tiny. We think 17 people currently acknowledged as having been disappeared during the Troubles period. But also, and crucially, those people were not disappeared by state forces. These are not enforced disappearances in the technical sense. They're people, also crucially, they were disappeared by paramilitary forces, specifically by Republican paramilitary forces of different types. also crucially, they are people from within that same community. So this is the IRA and other affiliated groups using disappearance specifically as a punishment, a targeted punishment for people that they considered, and this is incorrect, to have been informants, to have been in some way in collusion with the British state. And that is very, very significant in understanding how the whole question was managed. So here in Northern Ireland, the disappeared is almost a dirty secret of the IRA, of the former paramilitary groups on that side. It's not something that they themselves would promote the memory of. And what you'll hear is much focus on the killings of the Troubles. And again, those killings were predominantly by non-state forces, although state forces also were responsible. But the question of the disappeared has been managed in a very, very quiet way, in a very, very under the radar way. It has almost suited everyone. And that includes, with a certain kind of exception that we may have time to talk about or not, even the families of the disappeared. So this has been dealt with in a way that my colleague Lauren Dempster has called quiet transitional justice. So specifically, the matter of the disappeared in Northern Ireland has been given very particular attention by both the Republic of Ireland and by the UK by setting up a bilateral state search commission that has looked for and tried to recover the remains, and it is acknowledged by all concerned that those 17 people were killed. And the remains of those people, to find them, to identify them, and to return them to their families. And in that sense, and within that framing, it's been reasonably successful. So there are 2 people remaining to be found of that list. There are no cases, other cases we believe, coming on stream. It's very, very striking to me, as someone who moves between the Latin American and the Northern Ireland settings, those very strong differences. So, and as a final example, and I know we will come back to different aspects of the issue, but here in Northern Ireland, there's lots of political muralism that commemorates victims on both sides, paramilitaries and former communities where paramilitarism would have been active and is still somehow present, would celebrate, would commemorate their victims, their martyrs, if you like. There is not a single visual reference to the disappeared that I've ever been able to see in Northern Ireland, with the single exception of what's called the International Wall on the Falls Road, where nationalist communities traditionally have produce murals that are in solidarity with different issues around the world. And there's a tiny corner of one international solidarity mural that mentions Guatemala and the Madres of Guatemala, but nothing. There's no sense in which a parallel will be drawn to the situation of the disappeared here in Northern Ireland. And as a consequence, or as another, maybe a symptom of that difference, I remember clearly relatives here in Northern Ireland telling me very proudly of how they had worked very hard after the peace agreement to have their disappeared relatives declared dead. That was the way in which they resolved. That is something that is anathema in all of the Latin American settings, the South American settings that I know, where, of course, quite the opposite. Always the contention was they were taken alive by the state. We want them back alive, and we will not allow the presumption of death. And in fact, Chile, like many other Latin American countries, passed specific laws of absence by reason of enforced disappearance, this peculiar liminal category where people are neither alive nor dead, they are disappeared until such time as the state provides reliable information about them. And therefore, certain things follow from that. And a discussion recently had in Chile about whether people in that category should appear, for example, in the electoral register. Some relatives were very unhappy when people among the disappeared appeared on a new electoral register. As an organization, as the Observatorio, and personally, and I felt that they absolutely should appear on that register, but the specific fact that they're absent by reason of enforced disappearance should also appear. And that's something that now happens. And I found through just anecdotally, through other engagement with students and in other settings, a student who said, yeah, I went along to vote, and above me in the list, it's a very old-fashioned register that you sign, above me in the register was someone whose name was there and then absent by reason. And it really struck home to me that this could, this is something that happened to people like me. So, I can see visibly that is having an effect. So it's a very, very contrasting situation. but great lengths gone to make disappearance visible, to almost construct it as the archetypal kind of representation of the harm done under the dictatorship on the one hand, and a very, very submerged, a very, very hands-off way of almost preferring not to talk about that, and foregrounding other kinds of harm in the setting of Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Kath. So that was a fascinating account of not even a comparative exercise, but a contrasting exercise to really see entirely different outcomes. So thanks for making that. And I also heard a really fascinating connection back to what Silvana started about with the figure of the innocent victim. So creating the victim as innocent or not, we see is really central in memorializing. So now I would give the floor to Ulrike with a question on meaningful practices of memorialization, specifically in urban spaces. So Kath, you pointed out how it's visible somewhere, how it's not visible in other areas. And I would like Ulrike to give us more information and more context on that.
Hello, thank you, Gracinia. Welcome to all from Guadalajara, Mexico. So I also, first of all, would like to thank you for organizing this and putting together this panel, and welcome you all. So let me start with a very short reflection on the relation of urban space and memory and disappearance, as argued by French sociologist Maurice Halbwachs. Almost 100 years ago, collective memories are not only inscribed in social frameworks of memory, but they are at the same time spatially determined. The collective frameworks of memory are also shaped by spatial locations and physical surroundings. That means that the city, with its manifold overlapping historical layers, always is a space for multiple meanings, inscriptions, and contestations. And these memoryscapes, as we could call them, are inscribed in the urban palimpsest. As different layers of memory override one another, the binaries between forgetting and remembering, and absence and presence, also take on tangible spatial expressions in urban spaces, and this becomes especially relevant and meaningful in the case of enforced disappearances. So the spatial and material turn has brought new dimensions of research, also in the field of memory studies, highlighting the importance of space, place, and built environment, and especially when it comes to the commemoration of the dead. And of course, sociologist Gabriel Gatti has pointed out the complexity and impossibility when it comes to representing disappearances, and especially the void left by this repressive practice. And as the disappeared cannot be considered as dead, and this refers to this limbo, this liminal category that Kate Collins has just also referred to. Therefore, there is a huge tension in how disappearances can be commemorated in urban space. That means that often memorialization of disappearances include creative, ephemeral interventions such as performances, graffiti, or murals that are associated with ephemeral ways of commemoration, as protest marches or demonstrations, interventions, or temporary resignifications. That's only one part of it, of course. The photograph is still one of the most important way of commemorating disappearances in urban space, as Silvana just mentioned as well. So another important part of memorialization practices related to disappearances reflect the absence of bodies in multiple ways, artistically and symbolically. Repressive regimes or violent states use disappearances precisely to deny the fact and leave no trace of the body to secure impunity of the crime. So the immediate result is that surviving family members are left without physical locations or remains to mourn their dead. Often memorials or memorial museums are created at resignified former clandestine torture centers, where visitors are encouraged to explore the the history of state-sponsored torture and violence. And some emblematic examples here are, of course, the ESMA's Escuela de la Mecánica de la Armada, which is in Buenos Aires, where 5,000 persons disappeared, and during the last Argentine dictatorship, or the Villa Grimaldi and the Peace Park in Santiago, Chile, one of the first memorial spaces in Latin America after the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. Maybe this is like my first reflection on this connection of urban space and the memorialization of enforced disappearance.
Thank you, Ulrike. And it's kind of closes this first round of questions really nicely on the absence, and mentioning also the bodies, how the absence of the bodies is this key element also in how artistically enforced disappearances can be remembered. And we are in this really peculiar moment in history where we do see a number of attacks on memory initiatives. And I imagine that all of us in this room have our own also understanding of that, and seeing that in various contexts, how it happens all over the world. And I would like Silvana to tell us a bit more about attacks on memory initiatives in the context of enforced disappearances, and how you would see them, address them, and classify them.
Thank you, Gratina. So first, as it obvious, attacks on memory initiatives come in many shapes, and they change again with the context, I think. They are not only physical or institutional, but also symbolic, unfolding through words, narrative that seek to rewrite the past. And I'm thinking here in particular contexts, like Argentina in recent years, especially since the rise to power of the far right, with the presidency of Javier Milei, but also in Brazil and under Bolsonaro, or in Chile in the last years. What we are witnessing here is not a collection of isolated attacks, but concerted effort to reshape the narrative of the past. No, they don't just target what is remembered, so the content could say, but also who remembers. No, the relatives, the victims, the institutions that keep the memory alive. I think that these developments need to be seen in a broader context. And that context is the rise of illiberal memories, something that we are seeing not only in Latin America, but also in Europe, in Russia, in Hungary, in Poland, in the United States, and in many countries in Latin America. So illiberal memory, to put it simply, it can be considered as a kind of distorted image of liberal democratic memory, as a reaction or a backlash against a post-war consensus that connected memory with democracy and human rights. So illiberal memories has many different strategies, but to put it simple, denies responsibility, for instance, for past injustices, at the same time claiming victimhood, so at victims that are not recognized, or it reverses or tries to reverse the moral order, rehabilitating perpetrators, discrediting victims, for instance, normalizing the past in different ways. To come back to Argentina, we are witnessing now a direct challenge to what for decades seemed a stable social consensus around memory, trust, and justice. And it's not necessary to say maybe that Argentina has been a kind of paradigmatic case in terms of good practices, with a long history of memorialization and successful, we would say, politics of memory regarding disappearances. The new government has revived discourses, Milei presidency, but it began before with Macri and also even after. But now we see this at the level of, these discourses relativize or even deny state terrorism. For instance, the dictatorship is no longer described as a state terror, but as a war between two sides. So the theory of the two demons that is already very known. Human rights activists are mocked or are discredited. For instance, Macri before and now Milei calls human rights a curro, so that in Spanish means like a scam. All debates have been reopened about the number of the disappeared, for instance, with claims that it wasn't 30,000, so the number is not real. We also see movements promoting memoria completa, complete memory. So this idea that it's a call for so-called balanced view of the past, but in practice it relativizes state terrorism. Even the vice president, Victoria Villarruel, it's a kind of embodiment of this revisionist turn in Argentina, current struggles over memory. These attacks, so that we can trying to change the narrative, go hand in hand with institutional measures, for instance, cutting funds or threatening to close emblematic memory sites like the ESMA that Ulrike mentioned before, and other memory sites. And it also includes attacks on key figures of memory. No, just to give you an idea of the level of verbal violence, one of the government main ideologies, Agustín Laje, literally said about the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, no, I think the emblematic memory actor in Argentina, son unas viejas hijas de puta. Eso es lo que son. So it's translate like they are just a bunch of old bitches. No, that's what they are. It says many times. So what is striking is also the return of the language of the dictatorship. So words that were used in the 70s to stigmatize political opponents like zurdo, no, is used again as a derogatory term, say leftist, no, widely used. What is it for me? A kind of act of counter memory again for the 70s, and this is amplified. These dynamics are amplifying the digital space, again, if we think about memory. Now the digital environment becomes an arena in which these battles unfold, and this makes memory struggles faster, louder, more visible, but also more aggressive and more harder to contain. So it becomes a difficult space. So what we see with these attacks, I think that memory is never secure or never fixed. Even in societies that seem to have stable agreements about their violent past, those foundations can erode very quickly. But I think this is, in fact, an open question. We don't know. It's an open question about consensus. No, if we think about Argentina, did such a consensus ever really exist across broad sectors of society, or does it still exist today? Because recent research has shown, for instance, that many of those who voted for Milei don't actually agree or share his views on the dictatorship of the disappeared. But they say they simply, it's not an important issue now, no? That there are more urgent problems, mainly the economic crisis. So I think these attacks, and not only in Argentina, but also in a broader context, force us to think about the notion of consensus, no? And about the uneasy bond between memory and democracy. Because democracy, after all, thrives on plural memories and the coexistence of different voices and perspectives, of course, but its openness also, of course, poses a challenge. No? Where do we draw the line between diversity, plurality of memory and these attacks? And if the liberal memory consensus has indeed been fractured, how do we rebuild it? And what failed in that shared narrative that once seems strong?
Thank you, Silvana. And it's really reflects back on what we talked about in the first round of question, and how memorialization is really framing the victim, kind of getting the stage back, whereas the attacks then on memorialization is stigmatizing the victim again and taking that away as well. And I wanted to ask Kath about a very particular attack on institutions. So Kath, who has shared her expertise on Ireland with us already and on Chile, I wanted to ask you about the attacks on the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago, and how you would situate those in the broader discussion on memorialization and enforced disappearances.
Thank you. I'm not right up to date on specifically the Memory Museum issues, although the whole history of the Memory Museum has been a checkered one in that respect. what's been happening more recently is not, as far as I know, specifically clustered around the museum, although maybe there's something I've missed. I've been away for about 4 weeks now from Chile. But the museum, some will know, some will not, it was introduced and inaugurated at the end of a series of centre-left governments. It was the final one presided over by Michelle Bachelet, of course, and went on to various roles within the UN. Right from its inception, the museum has been subject to, I don't like to say the usual, but they are the usual kind of ideological attacks from the political right, that it's biased, that it's just a museum to communism, to terrorism, to all of these awful, terrible people. So that, you know, that kind of noise has almost been a constant from the political right since the museum was ever inaugurated. The legal status of the museum, probably in response to that, is quite a particular one. It's not a state museum like other state museums. It's a private foundation with public funds. And that was to protect it from what we all knew was coming, which was right-wing administrations that wouldn't want to support the museum. So that's in a sense protected it, and in a sense made it already a sort of slightly precarious when you look at something like that and say, okay, is this the state quite openly and quite confidently, if you like, drawing a line and saying these things happened and these other versions of events are not true? It is and it isn't. It does and it doesn't, even from its inception, have that symbolism, because it was created already under this kind of strange figure of public-private. It means that a very effective way, beyond just the ideological noise about what is true, about what is in the museum. Nothing specific within the museum's narrative has ever, kind of, if you like, been able to be disproven or shown to be inaccurate. And that's, but again, there's a certain amount of there was a certain amount of self-limitation at the beginning with that, in that the museum was very, very carefully constructed to follow the narrative of the First Truth Commission report, which talks about certain things, doesn't talk about other things. The museum, I think, has done an excellent job since then of moving its mandate forward and of engaging with all kinds of different issues and with all kinds of different ways that it wasn't set up to do, or that it was set up, if you like, to carefully not do too quickly or too soon. I think it's become a very strong and a very visible force in the memory debate, and has also moved outside of Santiago into the regions of the country. However, of course, you know, there's a line of ideological attack that's always been there. The easiest concrete practical expression of that is simply to limit funds to the museum. So, you know, beyond the ideological attacks, what matters more, if you like, to the museum's essential mission is when the parliamentary, you know, when the budgets are voted through and Parliament quietly sets about cutting, not renewing grants, not having staff kind of made available to the museum. So there's that kind of interplay of the ideological and the very, very concrete attempts to really just muzzle the museum without overtly being seen to do so, and that's been a constant. What I did want to mention, and I hope it doesn't take us too off topic, is since we are talking specifically about disappearance, the museum, of course, is set up to deal with every kind of core atrocity crime that happened during the dictatorship. Around disappearance, what has been made even more kind of ideological noise and been even more unpleasant in a sense is what has happened around the very occasional reappearances of people alive who were on the list, either from the initial Truth Commission or from subsequent follow-up, or people who were assumed to be detained, disappeared. There are 2 cases of people, adults, other than children being traced, who'd been appropriated and abducted, of 2 cases of people who were on the lists. Chile's very, right from the beginning, divided its universe of absent and missing victims into victims of politically motivated execution, who everyone acknowledged to have died, and the detained, disappeared. 2 people on that second list of the detained, disappeared subsequently appear alive, both of them living in Argentina. One recent case, one historical case, and one recent case yet to be confirmed. And it's in both times, the reaction to it has been very, very revealing, and not in a very, very positive way. And I think in ways that everyone, including the human rights community, needs to ask questions about. So it is treated as though, one, error, if we even want to call it an error on the list, invalidates the whole list. And also as though the appearance of a person alive who the dictatorship attempted to annihilate, to the point where it sent them into hiding and then never came home again, is something to be lamented rather than to be celebrated. You know, we say they took them alive, we want them back alive. And here are two people, we think, certainly one person who is alive. And that should be something that we can applaud. And yet for everyone, this was so uncomfortable because it played into this permanent kind of ideological noise from the right about this is all a lie. All of these people escaped from the country. They're all living abroad in great high, in a very well-off situation. This is all propaganda. This is all lies from the left. And therefore, at least a good proportion of the human rights community and relatives associations very much on the defensive against that, and also issuing kind of opprobrium against those people, saying yes, they should have come back to the country before, they should have told everyone. Why are their family been exercising their rights to reparation? Did their family know that they were alive? If so, they should pay back all of these pension entitlements. Really, everyone kind of perpetuating the notion that it would have been much more comfortable for all concerned had these people never surfaced to life. And I think that that's a very, very perverse and very, very kind of dangerous dynamic to get into, when in fact, of course, what we should be continuing to campaign for and to welcome is the notion that anyone could survive from that alive. So I think we need to be very, very careful not to play into the hands of that discourse. One way to do it is to question, I think, how far we proceed on this road of individualization. Important though it may be, you know, the numbers game, and I don't use the word game lightly, but the kind of, yes, we need to know who exactly was and was not. Who are we still searching for? Not least because we need names, we need identities, we need reference. If we're ever going to identify people who we do find, if we find people deceased, then we need to have identities that we can attach to those people. At the same time, to tie ourselves to this, well, if this name is disproven, then we calls everything into question. You know, I think there's something to be said there for Maladies and their insistence that all for one and one for all. One is too many. How many cases is enough? How many cases is an acceptable, level of disappearance? How many is an acceptable level of error when we try to reconstruct? And I think it's important to emphasize, as when I've been called upon to talk to some legislative committees around the recent search committee and processes of identification, I always do. Why is this so difficult? Why is it so hard to know who's fault is it that it's so difficult to know? So the institutions who know perfectly well and could resolve almost all of these ambiguities around the edges of who is disappeared and where they sit quite quietly, and they sit, I think, really amusing themselves while we tie ourselves up in knots, forced onto the defensive, trying to justify why one name on the list should not be on the list, and so on and so forth. So I think that sense of individuation, which can be very important, because every person is a world and every person has a right to be searched for in every family or community of reference, because not everyone is primarily identified with their nuclear or biological family, needs to be given answers. At the same time, I think it's important to keep hold of the collective dimension of the harm that is done to all when anyone can be or is disappeared for any reason. And I think in that sense, just to finish this point, I've become increasingly interested in, or starting to think about, what aspect is it that we usefully emphasize when we try to communicate to our community, our society, wherever that might be, the harm, the particular and the general harm that these disappearances have caused. Because one avenue, and I know why it's happened, is to actually, as has happened quite a lot in Argentina and a little bit in Chile in recent years, is to reclaim, if you like, the political identities, the political project of those people, and to say these people were not disappeared by accident or by just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These were people who were targeted for annihilation because of their project for social justice. It's a very, very important thing to not lose sight of. At the same time, so in that sense, we're saying what we miss is what these people brought to our society, right? Los desaparecidos nos faltan a todos. We're all the poorer because those people are no longer among us. Okay. There is sadly a group of people in each of our societies that thinks that the society is much better off because those people are no longer among us. And that, going down that road of why we need to resist this, puts us in direct binary confrontation with that discourse. And that's necessary and important. Another line of, if you like, argument about what it is we lose is this emphasis on what we all risk if this can happen to anyone. And that's if you like a more kind of identity neutral human rights kind of version of the discourse of why, particularly when this is state sponsored disappearance, why this cannot and should not be allowed to happen, no matter who it was, and in some senses, we might want to think about when that particular version of the discussion is more helpful. So in the case of Northern Ireland, to go back there and finish, we have 17 cases of disappearance, among them a British soldier who was undercover and who disappeared in the context of working as an undercover agent. No one wants to touch that case. That will be, if that case is ever resolved, I'll be very surprised. It's the only one that no one wants to help with. And it's because of who he is. So it's the flip side of what I was just saying. So if it becomes very important to say, vindicate, if you like, revindicate who these people were, in order to explain why we miss them, to explain why we search for them, to explain why they deserve truth and justice, then what do we do about the uncomfortable cases or the implicated victims, if you like? And I think this argument of saying, what do we all lose if anyone can be disappeared by state authorities, anyone, no matter how morally difficult or politically difficult they can be, then we draw a closer, if you like, equivalence between, let me think about El Salvador for a moment, between the people who disappeared during the internal conflict in El Salvador and the people who are targeted for social cleansing and disappearance now in El Salvador, who are less, if you like, politically and morally kind of celebrated people. What we want to avoid is people saying, yeah, I object to those people having been disappeared, but do you know what? I don't kind of really, with these delinquentes and these gang members, well, it's a different story because of who they are. So I think we have a difficult moral line to walk there in terms of what it is about the essence of disappearance that we invite society as a whole to be concerned about and therefore to repudiate.
Thank you. Thank you, Kath. And both for bringing in this uncomfortability that certain narratives and certain positions of some of the disappeared might raise, not only at the far right, but might raise across the board, but also to show us how this public-private divide that might play in a number of places has some advantages, but also comes with dangers, right? So the state, whether the state steps in or whether the state keeps out, is sending a message. So this message is read on the ground as well. And while it kept the museum going, likely, it also, as you rightly pointed out, it showed, it made it also more prone to be attacked. So now I would like to pose a question to Ulrike on conflicts around exhumation in Mexico from the point of view of families. So exhumations, you talked in your last comment also already about remains. So exhumations are one of the ways to bring the persons back, right? To bring the faces back, the people. So what is the conflicts and around this part so crucial for memorialization?
Thank you, Grażyna. Thanks for this question. So first of all, I would like to emphasize one important difference related to what Silvana and Kat have just pointed out, and that is if we now start talking about more closely to the Mexican case, that the situation is quite different in the sense that in the sense of the political and social context, as the humanitarian crisis that we live here and the human rights crisis is ongoing, and it happens. The disappearances are happening on daily basis. So in Mexico, massive disappearances are like happening all the time, and that is a very important difference when we see the historical cases that in the Southern Cone that Silvana and Kat Collins have been just talking about, in the sense also of the time elapsed, and this is extremely important when it comes to memorialization processes and also the generational change that is implied here. We hear the activities to commemorate and the search and the search that is mainly been taken over by search collectives of mothers of the disappeared here. They are just ongoing, and this is a completely different perspective in the sense that the exhumations that are taking place here are taken over by mainly search collectives that are formed by mothers of the disappeared, who take over the work that would have to be done necessarily by the state, and therefore, I mean, this creates also tensions among different search collectives. So not all search collectives are like defending or are doing these works of exhumations, but many also prefer to search their disappeared victims that are victims of organized crime and of the state that is included into these crimes, and this is related to these crimes as they are not investigating, and there is like the impunity situation is almost complete, almost yeah. So we have this situation here that other search collectives prefer just to search for the disappeared in like when they're still alive, right? They don't want to search for them. They defend just this protest claim that we want them back alive. You took them alive, and we want them back alive. So they are not into searching in mass graves or. I mean, this is a kind of similarity here, but you might have all heard of the Rancho Izaguirre that was discovered by search collectives, by mothers of the disappeared, mothers who searched for the disappeared here in March this year. It's Rancho Izaguirre. It's a place around 30 kilometers away from Guadalajara. This is where I'm based, here in Jalisco, and it is the extermination camp. We can say it was this extermination camp with crematoriums, meaning that people were not only taken by organized crime, and these were mainly very young persons who disappeared. Here, I mean, the age average is every day it becomes younger and younger. Now we have the age average from 15 to around 29, so that's really very young, and they are being recruited by the local drug cartel, and yeah, so this was something that is still very, very palpable here in Guadalajara. So we have also on our campus and at the UDG, Universidad de Guadalajara, we have several memorials since then that are also claiming back the the young disappeared students. We have several students disappeared that have disappeared also, that traces that go back to the Rancho Izaguirre. So this is a very, very ongoing situation, and the main difference here to the situation in the memorialization processes in the Southern Cone is that there is just not this of course, the enforced disappearances are always political, but there has been no like this dictatorship or repressive context around them, but just the state is just not investigating these crimes, and on a local level is also collaborating with organized crime. So this is what is the very different context here. And what I really wanted to share was some concrete interventions that we have here on the local basis. I don't know if, I mean, in Guadalajara by search collectives, like very effective strategies of memorialization in urban space. I don't know if we have still time for this, so I've just prepared some images if we still have the time. So I can just very briefly share my screen. Let me see if it works. So can you see can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. It's
okay. So very briefly. So first of all, I mean, we could say that the dominant and established concept in Mexican debates is the anti-monument. That's defined as a constructed memorial typically placed during a popular protest march, and it seeks to remember recent violent events or claim for justice for crimes to which the government has not given satisfactory responses. So I hope you can you see these are just some examples of anti-monuments here. And some of them here are taken from the route of memory that has been installed in Mexico City as an iconic as a very iconic Paseo de la Reforma, featuring several anti-monuments dedicated to the disappeared, creating just a kind of an urban counter-narrative. The first monument, anti-monument, was symbolizing the number of the mass plus 43, like the mass 43 in memory of the disappeared students of Ayotzinapa, that was installed in April 2015, 7 months after the disappearance by students' families. And another is the mass 72 plus 72 memorial, also at the Paseo de la Reforma, that was placed in front of the US embassy located there to denounce the disappearance of 72 Central American migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas in 2010, where these disappeared were allegedly murdered by the drug cartel Los Zetas. So this is just one example, and we can also see different other interventions in urban space. So I would also talk about the appropriation and resignification of urban space, and here's a kind of an example. The case of the roundabout of the disappeared. This is another important memorial that was resignified and that can be understood as a form of appropriation of territorial markers, where, as in this case, plaques and banners and posters, like photographs of the disappeared, are placed at the already existing memory site. And this already existing memory site that was resignified historically remembered the historical teenage soldiers of the Battle of Chapultepec. This was just one of the most important historical myths of Mexican history in 1947, that has been the Chapultepec of a battle that remembers an invasion of the US invasion and the resistance against it. So this is a kind of claiming the historical, claiming the current desaparecidos as part of the national memory culture, right? And that they are the real niños héroes, the niños héroes of the present, right? So in that sense, there is a whole resignification process behind it. And this memorial has become a meeting point to demand the search of the disappeared, as relatives have symbolically appropriated it to demand truth and justice, and relatives of the disappeared have also permanently resignified this memorial, showing that at any time, depending on the political context of the present, monuments can be re-questioned and also reappropriated and repoliticized in the sense. So it is a very interesting case here, and we have these roundabouts of disappeared not only in Guadalajara, we have it also in a similar case in Ciudad de Mexico,
Ulrike?
in Mexico City. Yes.
Could I ask you to come to a stop so that we can open for a Q&A?
Of course. So that was these are two very short examples that I just wanted to give, like for the memorialization processes here. And yeah, so I stopped sharing, and of course we can just come to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much both for highlighting how memorialization processes are different in places that are dangerous, actually, and where the disappearances are ongoing. That carries on extremely different situations for people involved, and also for the lovely pictures to see how former monuments are used also to kind of for finding them to current disappearances. So Katarzyna, if you could open up the Q&A. I had actually prepared one more round of questions, but this has been so fascinating that we are a bit running out of time, and I would love to give also the space to the participants to pose their questions. So feel free to raise your hand and or point your question into the chat box. And as I don't see anything yet, I would actually pose the question to Silvana and use the space for that. So you talked in one of your responses, you already mentioned the rise of liberal memories and how that plays out in this particular context. Could you tell us more about that, kind of on this broader contemporary context, how this rise of liberal memories plays out for the memorialization of enforced disappearances in various contexts?
Yeah, sorry. So I think, as I said, there is a global or kind of broad rise of illiberal memories now in the world, and we are seeing that they go against the consensus that we reached after the Second World War, about the link of memory with democracy, in the sense that to address the past, to come into terms with the past, to criticize, if the states criticize the role in past injustices, that would open up a future without violence. Memory, the duty of memory was linked to the guarantee of no repetition also. And this was, the main idea. You have to come to terms with the past in order to prevent future atrocities and in order to guarantee democracy. I think there was a consensus, but since 2008, more or less, so with the crisis of a liberal democracy in other aspects, other dimensions, it also came a memory crisis and the rise of illiberal memories. I think in this sense, memories of disappearances are not an exception. Now it's a different case. But what we see and what is interesting for me, that in these cases, like Argentina, in which there was 40 years of memorialization effort and successful practices of memory, truth and justice, what we see is that this is, really called into question now, and that's why it raises questions about, okay, how solid the consensus was in that sense now, and what failed in that sense, and how can we rebuild? Because still, I think that memorialization of disappearances and other crimes are central for democracy.
Thank you. And thank you for making this democracy and human rights link. I think it's really at the core when we think about collective memorialization as well, to that this is not only about this particular person, but about bringing, as you said, Kat, bringing that particular person back to community. It's all of us who have lost something by that person not being present anymore. And we have a question by Marta. You have your hand up. If you could unmute yourself, and then I would do a round of questions. So then Etina would be and apologies for mispronouncing names, I'm sure. So let's take those two questions, and then I would give the floor back to the speakers.
Okay, may I speak? Is it? Okay, thank you. First, it's a superb panel. Thank you so much for your work and your thoughts. Really interesting. I did a webinar on the memory of painful pasts based on oral narratives, and your work complements that. I have two quick comments and a question. I wrote a book about the landscape of memorialization in Lowell, Mass, and I thought your comments about the absence of the body was really important. And for people who were buried in cemeteries, I wondered why they had a second monument in the relocated throughout the city. And I thought it was like a postmodern cemetery absent the pestilence of the corpse. So that there's these sort of all these postmodern cemeteries throughout cities now in the US. And the second quick comment is the New York Times just had an article on Kara Walker opening a new exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, where she's cut up Confederate statues and reassembled them to really change the meaning. So my question is, in the process of seeing people disappeared, which we are seeing now in the United States, many people who have not been named, who have come here, migrated here without proper papers, they're being disappeared. So do you think some of the memorialization and the process of the disappearances is happening on social media? And would you call that commentary, or could we really call that memorialization?
Wow, thank you for the rich comments and questions. I would collect the other comment that we have in the room and then give the speakers the floor back. Tina, your hand is up. Can you unmute yourself? I'm afraid I cannot do that, so. If you cannot unmute yourself, then maybe you can put a question into the question and answer chat, but hopefully you could unmute yourself at some point. And I would give the floor now to Nora, as you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for this super rich panel. Social media and online platforms have been coming a lot in the discussions, especially over the last few years. And we've been observing in different contexts the disinformation and the online targeting of survivors, families, as well as defenders and academics for sure. I'm just curious to learn if you ever, if there's any initiatives or any collective work to counter these efforts to discredit or silence survivors. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, Dorothea, if you have an issue, then send me a message and we will try to solve that technically. And in the meantime, I would give there you are. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, so then in the meantime, I would give the speakers the floor back. I think we had questions that would actually allow us to fill another hour of comments and discussions. So I would give you the floor back in the same order as we had during the speaking time. And we have 17 more minutes and not more questions. So what I would propose is that each of you would have 5 minutes to respond to the questions. And if you want to flag other things as well, then that would also be a good time. So I would say Silvana, Kat, and Ulrike. in that order, and each of you would have 5 minutes. And this time I would time you so that that we would clearly all be able to speak and respond.
Thank you, Marta and Nora, for the questions. I will be brief, but if I understood correctly, so our questions about social media, no, and the digital as a space for memorialization, no? Yeah, so I was doing a project. I'm working on digital memories, and what can I say that the digital as a space of memorialization functions in both ways as a public space, no? On the one hand, you have a lot of studies about the digital, the connection between digital and activism, no? And it was very based on this idea of network society, so people can use digital media to collectively organize and do activist memory work. And in some cases, like Ayotzinapa, one of the cases I studied, was essential, no? This movement, so the digital sphere was essential to promote a transnational and global movement seeking for justice in the case of Ayotzinapa. You see there digital media function in tandem, of course, with offline protests. Like, for instance, in the case of Mexico, it was the state, fue el Estado, was one of the main hashtags used to denounce, but it also, before being a hashtag, it was like a performance in El Zócalo in Mexico, no? But it was designed as such. So the collective organized the performance in the Zócalo, filmed, recorded the performance, and then uploaded on social media and did everything to start. Then, of course, the hashtag to trigger attention enough to become a hashtag that was very powerful. So we cannot think both spheres are distinct, but in the case of memory activism around certain cases is essential. And so there are some initiatives that are just online, no? Coming back in the case of Mexico, again, you have a lot of digital projects around faces and around archives of faces that are only online projects. And the circulation of these projects, of course, is different if it could have been just in the public sphere on the street. So there are specific logics, but and it can be a powerful instrument of activism. On the other hand, what we see when we think about of attacks is the social media can be a space of contestation, of debate, but the logics of social media, or particular kind of like Twitter, for instance, or X, becomes a kind of toxic space for these debates. Not really a space in which you can exchange arguments or reasons, or really the kind of update of the public sphere in the Habermas, the terms of Habermas, but it's more like a really aggressive and toxic space in which polarization between different narratives are reinforced and with a lot of logics behind, like the use of bots or like censorship that is also present in many cases. So these kind of logics that do not really contribute to memorialization or to debate about memory.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Silvana. So now I would pass the floor to Kat.
Thank you. And again, you need to worry about me because now I'm not hearing through the speakers. Thanks, lots and lots there. Of course, I won't touch on it all, but I think this question of social media and the increased exposure that now affects both those who are subject to disappearance and those who are active around it is a very double-edged sword. I often ask my students who are very international, and many of them practitioners, when we think about truth commissions, they're very, very struck, the power of public testimony by victims, the South African Truth Commission's public hearings, the Peruvian Truth Commission's public hearings. And then we ask ourselves, what would happen to those people if you did that now? You know what they would be exposed to in real time, which is not to say that they weren't even in the examples I've mentioned subject to recrimination and pressure. But I think we can all know how much more noise there would be from everywhere directed to those people. So there's this problem of exposure and of exposure to bad actors as well as to good actors, and sympathy and empathy. And then again, people want individuation, or tend to want individuation. Again, I'm talking about families, I'm talking about people's communities of reference. You don't want your person to be forgotten, to be one more amongst the anonymous mass of, when it's thousands and thousands of people, as in the case of Mexico. You don't want your person to get lost in all of that. But then again, what do you expose yourself to, or your family to, if you make yourself the face of search, the face of resistance? And we know that you expose yourself to being falling victim to the exact same violence, and to this other kind of opprobrium that we see it. The families in Northern Ireland were subject to decades of silencing and ostracism. Rather than danger, it was the fear of being made a non-person, persona non grata, within what was supposedly your own community. So people were literally treated as though they themselves had died. No one would speak to them. So there's a case of Jean McConville, who disappeared. She had 9 children. The children were left wandering the tower block from which she had been disappeared, alone. And they knocked on doors, and the doors were closed in their faces, because neighbours, not that they were frightened to take the children in, they themselves were part of the condemnation that had led to the mother being disappeared. It was seen as righteous exclusion, ostracism from the community. So what that did was to push those families into nowhere, to no person's land, and or push them towards the state as the only thing that could give them answers, which then of course enabled the people who had performed the disappearance to say, see, they were it's true, they were colluding with the state, they were traitors to our cause all along. So a very kind of, you know, a double bind there that took just decades and decades to overcome, if it has been overcome. And the only thing that lent some kind of voice was for there to be, if not safety, at least strength in numbers. So it really was not until those families managed to find a place to come together and to associate and to somehow have a collective voice that they managed to have find an interface, or find a way, if you like, of grappling and of dealing. So I think this question of individuation versus the collective identity is a key one. I was just at the launch of the Journal of Disappearance Studies. It took place in Notre Dame in the US, where I've been refusing to go. I did make that exception. And we talked about something Ulrika mentioned, the number, the 43, that number, that's someone from the Independent Expert Commission on Ayotzinapa was there. This iconic 43, again, there's always kind of layers and layers to this. 43, 43, 43, that's the number of disappeared students. And yet there were 6 people killed, including the bus driver, no one ever talks about. There were other people. So it's this kind of twin double-edged sword again, between the visible, the iconic, and the kind of not letting the numbers game, if you like, push us to not take care about others. What happens when you emphasize the numbers? Of course, the irony of doing that, launching that, in discussing disappearance in the US, where people were being disappeared by ICE in the street, you know, in Chicago, not too far from where we were, did not, of course, go unremarked. But a couple of other things just to say. Ulrika, thank you for what you said. That contemporary occurrence of disappearance alongside historical is sadly not limited to Mexico. El Salvador has it too. Central America in general has it too. It's morphed, it's different form, but it's not gone away. Europe, especially Southern Europe, now has it, of course, due to the migrant route and disappearances along the migrant route across the Mediterranean. The patterns are different. And in El Salvador, the difference between historical and some of the differences, many, between the historical and the contemporary disappearances, specifically the trans community, who are the people who said this to me. They said, you cannot assume that our relatives want to protect us. And they would know of cases where the family said, well, thank God he's disappeared. That degenerate. I don't want. So there's just such a different dynamic around what we assume about state bad, relatives good, that relatives in civil society are going to be the answer. When civil society itself shares the opprobrium to which those disappeared are subjected, it's really more difficult to make a kind of solid argument and to get people on side in acknowledging that this is unacceptable. Okay. The role of forensics. We forget. We treat forensics as meaning forensic archaeology, forensic anthropology, the exhumation of dead bodies. It's not just that. Forensic genetics, digital forensics. Forensics in its proper meaning, stretches right across all of the ways in which we find people alive and identify people sometimes alive as well. So I just want to say that. And the principles, and I'll finish with this, the principles, the UN guiding principles on search, which were just defined in 2019 after some meetings in Colombia in which some of us took part, there is a principle that says the person must be searched for alive on the presumption of life, no matter how long ago that disappearance began. That principle was contested, amongst others, by the non-state forensic groups in Latin America, who said, you know, you're tying us to not being able to do our work, because the fact that it was forensic anthropologists who were going out looking for bodies in Argentina was rejected initially by madres, amongst others, saying, you know, we don't accept that our children are dead. So how can you give a forensic response? Because it presumes, if you like, that people are dead. So what you do about the notion of where you search and how you search, how do you translate that principle in somewhere like Chile, where most of the disappearances began 50 years ago? Okay, does it make sense in Spain to treat all of the disappeared of the Civil War as though they were still alive? What we said is, okay, well, we translate that principle in a way that makes sense. And the way it makes sense to us is we talk about searching for people, and we talk about recovering people and restoring identity to people and not to remains. We try to take that kind of coldness out of the language, but it doesn't stop us being realistic and being practical about what it is that our particular situation, a diagnosis of what our situation actually requires.
Kath, I need to
is necessary if our search and if our resistance is going to have is going to make sense to people. It's going to have kind of common sense in that quite particular way.
Okay, thank you, Kath. That's complicated with not hearing but speaking. So, but Ulrike, the floor is yours for your concluding remarks.
Oh, thank you very much, and also thanks for the important questions that were raised. So these are, of course, very broad questions. So I would like, maybe starting with my last comments, follow up on what Silvana and also Kat have mentioned. Enforced disappearances are phenomenons with globally recognizable aesthetic forms of memory work and protest practices, and these iconographies have traveled and circulated transnationally. And here I come back to this digital form of memorialization, the photographs that circulate, and these, as I already mentioned, are extremely important also for the rehumanization and processes of decriminalization of the Mexican current disappeared, and also, I mean, this is kind of complex, because on the one hand, cities currently, whenever you come to Mexico, will see it, are flooded with photographs and images of the disappeared that are, of course, a strategy for reverting the re-victimization and criminalization discourses, but also an instrument of just for the practical search of the disappeared, right? So on the other hand, we have a kind of I mean, this is also a kind of normalization, because it becomes so much visible here in the urban spaces that so there's a whole process of toxic, we could say, the toxic normalization of this phenomenon here going on, that and also a taboo, that it becomes a social taboo. And at least the photographs are an attempt of breaking the social taboo. And also, of course, there is a whole, the online platforms of search collectives primarily work with those photographs, with circulating the photographs of the disappeared loved ones, and these are the main instruments of finding them alive. And so they have these practices have their symbolic origins in resistance against military dictatorships, again in Latin America, especially Argentina, as Silvana said, and we have these protest slogans such as "Dónde están?" "Where are they?" or "Vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos," alive they took them, and alive we want them. And these are taken over here by the local search collectives, right? So there is also a way of connection of protest forms that go back to the former experience of the dictatorship in the Southern Cone. Yeah, and maybe, I mean, there was a question of about these the exhumations or the memory landscapes and in cemeteries. And there, what comes into my mind is that the Franco dictatorship, and especially since 2010, the disappeared of the Spanish Civil War, and have been remembered in memorials for the disappeared, especially on cemeteries, and memorials that have been constructed in cemeteries almost all over the country, all over the Spanish landscape, to commemorate the disappeared victims of the Francoist repression. And this also has sparked a lot of debate currently, a lot of contestation. And there is a very emblematic case in Madrid, at the Almudena Cemetery in Madrid, where a memorial was constructed to honor 2,930 victims executed there as part of the Francoist repression of the Civil War. And then it was when the Vox local government and right-wing local government took power, it was completely destroyed. And it was a wall of names, which is also a very common symbolic framework of commemorating disappearances. And there was a list of names of the victims that were then completely destroyed again. So that there was a double second disappearance going on, and that memorial. And this is also, I think, interesting from a forensic perspective, because at that special experience and case, this memorial was not connected to human remains, but it was still on a cemetery, located at a cemetery. So this is very interesting, because this refers to this ambiguity of the absence of the bodies. And when they're still remembered on a cemetery, this is a kind of something that the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo would reject categorically, right? So this is like, yeah. So just to refer also to Silvana's contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. And we reached the end. So thank you, Silvana, Ulrike, and Kath, as well as to the audience for the questions and for bearing with us. This has been extremely rich and fascinating, and we don't have the time or the capacity to really sum up what has been said. What I think I'm taking with me, I just wanted to point out 3 issues. So firstly, commemoration as making the absent present again, so kind of bringing them back. Secondly, as rehumanizing the disappeared back. So that is kind of countering what the enforced disappearance was in place for. And thirdly, that we have so many narratives and counter-narratives that are and have been throughout the last decades in contrast, and that might be and that are currently clashing even more due to the broader trend of illiberalism growing globally. But much more things have been said, so I have lots of notes. Thanks a lot. I just wanted kind of to have some thoughts, and thank you again, everyone, for participating. This has been really, really informative and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina, for organizing this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Have a good day. Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.